Good morning. Today we are going to be talking about the respiratory system. So the first thing that we need to talk about if we're going to talk about the respiratory system is what the job of the respiratory system is. And the function and the job, what it does for our body, is it supplies us with oxygen first, and it gets rid of waste, right? So it gives oxygen and it takes away waste gases like carbon dioxide. And so we're going to just sum this up by saying it's responsible for exchanging gases, oxygen and carbon dioxide, right? That is the main function of the respiratory system. And it does that through a cool process that we're going to discuss today. So we're going to be color coding again today. You guys know I like my colors. And we're going to start at the very top with red for our mouth and nose. Our mouth and nose is very important for our respiratory system. The nose is actually the main external opening, the main way that we get oxygen into our body, right? And in this way, through our nose and through our mouth, air enters our body and exits the body, right? We don't have another opening that allows air. We don't breathe out through our ears, right? We breathe out through our mouth and nose. The mouth is also used for taking in and expelling. This just means removing, right? Air from the body, right? And so the mouth and nose have some very important parts that help them do this. If you've ever noticed, your mouth and nose are kind of moist and wet, and that's because if we breathe in a whole bunch of cold or really hot air into our lungs, it's going to change our body temperature, because you see how close it is to our heart, and it's our central core of our body, right? One of our vital organs. So our nose has hairs that warm the air. They also help filter out different particles, things like dust and pollen. They sometimes get irritated, and so we sneeze, right? Or those same things happen in our mouth, and so in the back of our throat, it kind of tickles and it makes us cough. Those are all functions of the mouth and the nose. Okay, so we're going to color our mouth red. We're actually going to add some stuff up here for our next section, because I think it's important that you guys know that there are some other parts in our throat and in our in our face that help protect us, that help us breathe, that are an important part of the respiratory system. Okay, so we've got our red box for our mouth and nose. And now we're going to add our sinuses, specifically called our paranasal sinuses. So we're going to draw those on because they're actually kind of on either side of the nose. And they may be a little differently shaped in everybody's head, but these are the paranasal sinuses. And their job is to do several things for us. The main job that they have is to produce mucus. And you might be thinking, ooh, mucus. But guess what? Mucus is an important part of our respiratory system protecting ourselves, right? This is an opening where we're breathing in things into our body. And so our paranasal sinuses produce this mucus that lines our nose, that lines the back of our throat, that helps catch bacteria and viruses that could make us sick, right? That's kind of very important right now. I'm going to go ahead and color these in orange. The paranasal sinuses do a couple of other things. They help lighten your skull so that our head isn't so heavy, because they're not really full of anything. They're kind of empty space in our face, okay? And bone is heavy, and so it helps make our head not quite so heavy because it's supported by our little tiny neck, right? It also helps give your voice tone. So some people have a more nasally tone to their voice, some people have a deeper tone, and part of that is in your has to do with your paranasal sinuses, and how large or small they are, how full of mucus they can be, and so those things can affect our tone. There's a couple of other parts. We're going to kind of put them on his arms. You can't see them in this diagram, but I want you to know these words. And the first word is pharynx. And the pharynx is the throat. The throat is kind of like our nasal passageways, right? It's warm and moist. It helps get that air to be the right temperature before it goes into our lungs, which also can kill some bacteria, right? Because a lot of bacteria can't survive in certain temperatures. So the pharynx is important to getting that air into our trachea to get into our lungs. The other part is our larynx. And if you've ever heard of someone having laryngitis, right, not having a voice, that's because this is the voice box. And it actually works kind of like a guitar, right? There's all of these little cords that go over this opening into our, can you guys still see? Yeah, my light's always cut off. So there's these cords that run across kind of like a harp, right? And these muscles on either side pull them as air passes over and through those cords to give our voice sound. And so when we have mucus that's coating these cords, it gives us laryngitis, right? We can't speak as well because our voice box is coated with a thick layer of mucus, so we're not easily understood, okay? So those are just a couple of extra parts I thought you guys might like to know about. All right, we're going to switch to our trachea because that's where our air is going to go next. It's going to go from our mouth or nose into our pharynx, our throat, through our larynx, right, our voice box, and then it's going to go into our trachea. And our trachea is also known as our windpipe because wind goes through this pipe. It connects the larynx, and we just talked about that, or the voice box to the lungs. And it is made of cartilage. Why would our trachea need to be made of cartilage? Well, cartilage is tough. It's the same stuff that makes up the tip of your nose, makes up your ears, the hard part of your ears. And so it's tough, so it can hold its shape, but it still can be flexible. And that's what's very important about this particular tube, because this tube needs to be tough. It needs to stay open. And if it was soft muscle, it would close, right? It would, when it wasn't full, it would close up and shut, and that wouldn't be good because we need it open so that we can breathe. And so the cartilage gives it that shape, that structure. Okay, so we're going to color our trachea blue. And if you've ever seen someone who maybe had an injury or a disease and they had to have a hole cut into their windpipe because for some reason they couldn't get air into their lungs, this does not heal very well, and so a lot of times they have to have a little cover or a flap that's put on there that's plastic or fabric that keeps air from going in there, and they have to use a different device to be able to speak because it's below the larynx. Where the opening is to the throat is below the larynx. You see this a lot in people who have breathing disorders like emphysema or lung cancer. They sometimes have to have an opening cut here in the throat, and you may have seen their little device that they hold up that reads those vibrations that they're making with their lungs as sound and gives them a way to speak. So the trachea is very important, and when it gets damaged, because it's made of cartilage, which is a tough connective tissue, cartilage does not heal itself very well. Some of you maybe even have an ear piercing in your cartilage, and it takes way longer to heal than a regular ear piercing because the cartilage doesn't have a very strong blood flow, and we need blood in order to heal our parts of our body. So we're going to shade this box blue so we remember the trachea has to do with getting air into our lungs, right? So we are going to zip down here to where it's going to go next. So before it gets to the lungs, it's going to go through a couple more tubes, and we're going to switch to green for this one. Your bronchus are each of these branches. This is one bronchus, this is another bronchus. When we are talking about both bronchus, we call it bronchi or bronchi. Okay? And the bronchi are these two little splits because you've got to get air into your right lung and your left lung. So when it splits, we call it the bronchi. They're kind of like trees, right? They kind of branch off. It's branches is where this word comes from, okay? And so these are the passageways that get air into the lungs. As they get smaller, there's more of them that branch off, and they get smaller and smaller as they go, right? And so these are called bronchioles because they get smaller. Okay. And eventually they end up in these tiny sacs called alveoli. Right? That's kind of a funky word, but this is an important structure in our lungs. So those bronchi are filtering that air down smaller and smaller and smaller so that we can get small molecule sections, right? Just like our digestive system breaks our food down into smaller and smaller pieces, the passageways that our air travels down get smaller and smaller so that our body can easily absorb what it needs to from the air we breathe in, because we don't need everything we breathe in. In fact, most of the air we breathe in, we expel, because most of the air we breathe in is made of nitrogen. Like 70% of the air in our atmosphere is nitrogen, and we don't need that. We only need the oxygen, so that's the only part that we want to get into our bloodstream. And so our body does a good job of filtering out what we don't need and using what we do need. Okay, so eventually these tiny little parts make up this huge group, right? Our lungs. And our lungs we're going to use a dark purple for. And the lungs are the primary or the main organ, or organs because there's two of them, of the respiratory system. They take in oxygen. Remember, this is the job of the respiratory system. They take in the oxygen and they expel carbon dioxide. They're inflated and deflated by the action of the diaphragm. And the diaphragm is the muscle of the respiratory system, because no other part that we've talked about so far, except for the larynx, has muscle at all. So we need to kind of break that down and figure out how that diaphragm makes our lungs work. So we're going to come over here and I'm going to use a colored pencil so you can still see my green bronchioles. I'm going to shade my lungs purple. If you've ever had bronchitis or heard of bronchitis, that has to do with those bronchioles, right? That means an inflammation of those bronchioles. All right, so now we're going to talk about our diaphragm. Our diaphragm is the most important muscle. We're going to use pink for this one. In the respiratory system, it expands and contracts, just like all muscles, forcing air in and out of the lungs. This is very important because otherwise the lungs wouldn't ever be able to get air into them. This diaphragm right here, when it contracts, it pulls this way, kind of like a syringe, pulling air from the inside into the body. And when it relaxes, it lets the air release from the lungs. So it contracts and pulls the lungs open and relaxes and lets the air out, right? That's why when we sigh, right, like you have to kind of work to pull it in because that's the muscle contracting. And then when you release that sigh, it just kind of all falls out, right? You don't work to push it out farther. Now you can force air out, which pushes your diaphragm to work in the other direction. But for most things we do, we use our diaphragm to pull air in. Sometimes we get a spasm of this muscle, the diaphragm. This is called the hiccups, right? And so just like any muscle spasm or muscle cramp, if you stretch that muscle out by taking a big, long, deep breath, that helps force that muscle to kind of reset itself and stop getting those spasms. All right, so we've talked about all of these important parts, but you know, Miss Young always likes her part where the magic happens, right, in every system. And so in this particular system, the alveoli, where those bronchioles end up, remember we talked about those right over here? Those alveoli are where the magic happens in the lungs. So I'm going to use light purple for my alveoli because these are tiny little sacs, and I mean tiny because they have little blood vessels that go wrap around each and every one of them. And these are in the lungs. These are what most of the lung cavity is made of, are these small sacs. And they allow oxygen and carbon dioxide to move between the lungs, right, between where our lungs are and the rest of the body through the bloodstream. And so what I mean by this is, do you see this kind of cauliflower shaped object? This is kind of what those alveoli are shaped like. And so if we kind of make our little border, we've got this really thin layer of alveoli here. And wrapping around every one of those alveoli is a bloodstream, right? And blood is red, right? And so through this bloodstream, through these red blood cells, we're getting that exchange. These blood cells are picking up that oxygen, right? That oxygen is going into the bloodstream from the air that you breathe in. It's coming in through your trachea, through your bronchioles, all the way down to these little bitty alveoli, and it's giving your blood oxygen. So they're picking up these little molecules of oxygen to carry with them. Okay? And it's going to take that oxygen throughout the body. And then it's also bringing from the body this carbon dioxide on these blood cells. And that carbon dioxide gets pushed into those alveoli to be able to be released when we breathe that air out. And this is what makes our lungs important, because this is what puts oxygen into our bloodstream and helps us get rid of carbon dioxide. Because remember, what do we need for cellular respiration? We need oxygen. And so if we don't have that oxygen getting to our cells in our body, then we don't have life. So these alveoli are super important for our body to be able to function and work like it should. Okay? So I hope that helps you guys kind of understand and wrap your head around how your lungs work, how your diaphragm helps, how the alveoli work, how your respiratory system works to make sure that your body gets gases that it needs and gets rid of gases that it doesn't need. Have a fantastic day, and I'll see you again soon.